Alarms tear through the corridor before I even open my eyes. Red light floods the cabin. The floor shakes so hard that my water cup rolls off the shelf and shatters. I am 11 years old, and I do not yet know that this single night will decide the fate of my entire species. My mother grabs my arm and pulls me into the hallway. People are screaming. Somewhere above us, metal groans like a wounded animal. Our colony ship, the Kestrel, was never built for war. It was built for hope. 3,000 of us were sailing toward a new world, a quiet green planet, far from the noise of old Earth. We had no weapons worth mentioning. We had gardens. We had schools. We had nurseries. Then the krill ships arrived. I remember the shape of them through the viewport, dark and curved like claws against the stars. I remember the sound they made when they locked onto our hull, a deep metallic scream that traveled through every wall of the ship. My mother pushed me into a storage locker and told me to stay silent no matter what I heard. I did not understand why. I understand now. They took what they wanted. They took people. They studied us the way a child studies an insect before pulling off its legs, curious, careless, without any thought that we might feel it. When it was over, when the krill ships finally drifted away bored with their new toy, only 3 of us were still breathing among the ones they had taken. I was one of the lucky ones. I was left behind on the ship, hidden, forgotten in a locker built for spare oxygen tanks. I tell you this first because you need to understand what came after. You need to understand why, years later, when I stood in front of the Galactic Council in a tall chamber of glass and light, my voice did not shake even once. By then, I was a grown man. My name is Daniel Marsh, and I had been chosen to speak for every human being alive, on Earth and beyond it. The council chamber was enormous, built to awe. Every wall curved upward into a dome of moving stars, projected so perfectly that new visitors often forgot they were indoors. Around me sat delegates from 43 known species, some tall and thin as reeds, some low and wide like boulders with eyes, some barely visible except for a shimmer in the air. At the center of it all sat the Tesserae Compact, the oldest and most powerful members of the council, the ones everyone else looked to before making a single decision. I had come to deliver one message, not a request, not a plea, a warning. I told them what had happened to the Kestrel. I told them about the 3 survivors, about the empty rooms where children used to sleep, about the years my mother spent unable to say a single word without her hands trembling. I told them Earth was not asking for punishment against the krill. We had already handled that matter ourselves, quietly, permanently, in a way the council never fully investigated because they were too relieved not to have to deal with it themselves. What I told them next was the real reason I had traveled so far. I told the council that humanity remembers. Not for a year, not for a generation, forever. I told them that our history is full of examples where a debt was owed and, no matter how long it took, no matter how many decades or centuries passed, we found a way to settle it. I told them this was not a threat born of anger. It was simply a fact about who we are, passed from parent to child like a family name. Then I said the words that would follow me for the rest of my life. Humans will hunt you forever. I did not shout it. I said it calmly, the way you might warn a child not to touch a hot stove, because you know the pain that follows if the warning is ignored. For a moment, the chamber was silent. Then laughter rippled through the room, starting near the Tesserae seats and spreading outward like water poured over glass. Not cruel laughter, not really. Amused laughter, the laughter of ancient beings listening to a child boast about being tough. A tall Tesserae elder named Vos Kelleran, robes the color of deep space, rose slowly to respond. His voice was smooth, almost kind, the voice of someone who had given this same lecture 1,000 times to 1,000 younger species. He told me that emotion fades. He told me that vengeance is expensive, and every species that had ever tried to sustain a long war eventually ran out of resources, out of will, out of reasons to keep fighting long after the original wound had healed. He told me humanity would learn this lesson too, given enough time. He said it was not an insult, only an observation based on the long history of the galaxy. Species mature, grudges fade, politics move on. I remember looking around that chamber at all those ancient faces, creatures who had outlived empires, who had seen 100 species rise and fall, and I understood something they did not. They were measuring us by their own history, not by ours. They assumed that because their own memories dimmed with each new generation of leadership, ours would too. I did not argue with him. There was no point. Some lessons cannot be taught with words. I simply thanked the council for their time, gathered my notes, and walked out of that chamber without looking back. Outside, in the long silver hallway leading to the transport bay, my assistant, a sharp young woman named Claire Duncan, caught up with me, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. She asked me if I was upset by the laughter. I told her no. I told her something my mother used to say, back on the Kestrel, back before everything changed. She used to say that the people who laugh at a warning are usually the same people who end up living inside it. Claire did not fully understand what I meant that day. Neither did I. Not completely. Not yet. I only knew one thing for certain as I boarded the transport ship back toward Earth space. The Council believed our warning was empty because they had never met a species that treated memory as sacred, that taught its children not to forget, that built entire institutions around the simple idea that a promise made must be a promise kept, no matter how long it takes. They believed time would soften us. They had no idea that time was the one weapon we understood better than any species in that chamber. As our ship pulled away from the council station, I watched the great structure shrink behind us, its lights glittering like a city unaware of the storm gathering beyond its walls. I thought about the empty locker on the Kestrel, about the silence that followed, about the years my mother spent teaching me that patience is not weakness, that a quiet people can still be a dangerous people, that the ones who wait longest often strike hardest. I did not know then how long the road ahead would be. I did not know how many years would pass, how many quiet decisions would be made in small rooms on Earth, how many young men and women would grow up hearing this exact story, my story, the story of the Kestrel, and choose to carry it forward as their own. I only knew this. The laughter in that chamber would fade eventually, and when it did, they would remember exactly who had warned them and exactly how little they had listened. Behind me, Earth was waiting, not with anger, not yet, with patience. And patience, as I would come to understand many years later, is the most dangerous thing a species can possess, when it also possesses the will to never let go. On the flight home, Claire sat across from me, reading through the transcript of my speech on a small glass screen. She asked me a question I still remember word for word. She asked me if I truly believed the council would ever take us seriously, or if part of me had simply wanted to say the words out loud, for my own sake, for the sake of everyone who never got the chance to speak for themselves. I told her both things could be true at once. I looked out the window at the stars sliding past, thinking about my mother, who had passed away only 2 years earlier, quietly, in her sleep, still keeping a small photograph of the Kestrel on her nightstand until the very end. She never saw me stand in that chamber. She never heard me say those words, but she was the reason I knew how to say them. She used to tell me that grief without purpose becomes bitterness, but grief with purpose becomes strength that can be passed down like an heirloom. She raised me to understand that forgetting was not peace. Forgetting was simply a second wound layered over the first one. Earth had spent decades building itself back up after the Kestrel and the handful of incidents that followed it. We were still young among the stars, still learning, still finding our place among species who had been traveling the galaxy since before our ancestors learned to farm. But we were not foolish. We watched, we studied, we took careful notes on every species we met, on their strengths, their weaknesses, their patterns of thought. The council saw a young species making noise in a big room. They did not see a species that had already begun quietly preparing, long before I ever set foot in that chamber, for a future none of them could imagine. As the transport carried us home, I closed my eyes and let myself finally rest. Somewhere far behind us, in that glittering chamber of glass and light, the laughter was already beginning to fade from memory. Ours would not fade at all. I did not sleep during that flight, not really. I kept replaying the moment in the chamber, not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity, the way a person remembers the exact instant they understood something important about themselves. I thought about all the delegates who had laughed, each of them representing species far older than ours, each of them certain that history had already taught them everything worth knowing about how young civilizations behave once the sting of tragedy fades. I thought about a story my mother once told me, back when I was still small enough to sit on her lap during the long, quiet evenings after the Kestrel. She told me about an old human conflict, centuries before either of us were born, one that stretched across so many years that the grandchildren of the people who started it were the ones who finally saw it through to its end. She told me it was not a story about hatred, it was a story about patience, about a people who understood that giving up halfway through a promise was worse than never making the promise at all. I did not fully understand the lesson then. I understood it completely by the time I stepped off that transport back on Earth. When I finally reached home, the first thing I did was visit my mother's grave, something I had not done in over a year. I sat there for a long while, the wind moving quietly through the grass, and I told her everything that had happened in that chamber. Every word, every laugh, every careful, dismissive response from Vos Kelleran. I do not know if she could hear me. I only know that saying it out loud, to her, made the weight of it feel a little more bearable. In the weeks that followed, life on Earth continued much as it always had. Farmers tended their fields, children went to school. Ships continued their quiet trade routes along the edges of council space. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed at all. But within certain rooms, among certain people, a decision had already been made, one that would not be spoken about openly for many years to come. I was asked, not long after my return, to join a small advisory council formed quietly within Earth's Unified Assembly, a group tasked with studying long-term strategy regarding our place among the stars. I remember walking into that first meeting, still tired from the journey, still carrying the weight of that chamber's laughter, and finding a room full of quiet, serious faces who had clearly been waiting for someone to finally say out loud what many of them had already been thinking privately for years. We did not plan for war that day. We planned for patience. We began mapping out what it would mean, practically, to prepare a species not for a single conflict, but for the possibility of a struggle that might outlast every person sitting in that room. It was a strange kind of meeting, quiet and methodical, entirely without the drama such a decision might have carried in an old story. It felt, more than anything else, like planting a tree whose shade we knew we would never personally sit beneath. The message arrives at 3 in the morning, and I know before I even open it that something has gone wrong. 15 years have passed since I stood in that chamber, and in that time I have learned to recognize the particular silence that comes before bad news, a silence that settles over a household like snow before a storm. My daughter Grace is already awake when I reach the kitchen, standing by the window with her tablet glowing in her hands, her face lit blue in the dark. She is 26 now, tall and steady in a way that reminds me painfully of my mother. She does not look up when I enter. She simply turns the screen toward me. The Tesserae Compact has seized the Halden system. Halden was not a battlefield. It was a home. 400,000 people had spent 9 years turning a barren rock into something green, something livable, planting forests where there had only been dust, building schools where there had only been silence. It was the kind of project that took an entire generation of patience to complete, and the Compact took it in a single afternoon, citing an old clause buried so deep in council law that even our best legal teams had to read it 3 times to understand what had happened. There was no battle. There was no violence. Not in the way the Compact understood the word. They simply arrived with enough ships to make resistance meaningless, presented their claim, and gave our colonists 30 days to relocate. They did not expect us to fight. They barely expected us to protest. 15 years of quiet cooperation with the Council had convinced them, just as it had convinced most of the galaxy, that humanity had finally settled into its place among the smaller, more reasonable species. I remember standing in that kitchen, reading the report over Grace's shoulder, and I remember feeling something strange happen inside me. Not rage. Rage is loud, and this was quiet. It was the same quiet I had felt as a boy hiding in that storage locker, listening to the ship groan around me, understanding somewhere deep down that some wounds cannot be answered with noise. Grace finally spoke. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her the truth. I told her I did not fully know yet, but I knew where to begin, because I had spent 15 years preparing for a day I hoped would never come. What most people outside our closest circles never understood was that the years following my speech to the council had not been years of rest. They had been years of quiet work. While the wider galaxy watched humanity build farms and cities and trade routes, a much smaller number of us had been doing something else entirely. We had been studying. We had been mapping the patterns of every major species in council space, learning their military structures, their political cycles, their weaknesses hidden beneath centuries of comfortable peace. We learned that most council species change leadership every few years, and with each new leader comes a kind of forgetting. Old conflicts quietly filed away as ancient history, no longer relevant to modern politics. We learned that their fleets, powerful as they were, had not fought a real sustained conflict in generations, because no one had ever been foolish enough or patient enough to challenge them directly. We were foolish enough to try anyway. Grace had grown up hearing pieces of this story, the way children grow up hearing family legends that only make sense once they are old enough to understand the weight behind them. She knew about the Kestrel. She knew about my mother's photograph. She knew about the chamber, the laughter, the words I had said all those years ago. What she did not know, not fully, was how much of her own childhood had quietly been shaped around preparing for a moment like this one. She had trained with the Human Expeditionary Corps since she was 18, not because I pushed her into it, but because she asked to join on her own, the same year she finally read the full transcript of my council speech for the first time. She told me once that she wanted to be part of whatever answer we eventually gave. That answer began the morning after Halden was seized. I did not call for a vote in some grand assembly. There was no dramatic declaration broadcast across every human world. Earth's response was almost eerily calm, and I think that calm frightened our neighbors far more than anger ever could have. Within our closest circles of command, a single decision was made, and it echoed the very words I had spoken 15 years earlier. We sent one message back to the council: no demands, no threats, just coordinates marking the edge of Halden space, a date roughly 1 year in the future, and 3 simple words: we remember. I remember watching Grace read that message before it was sent, her eyes moving carefully over each word as though she understood, even then, that this small collection of letters would eventually be studied by historians on a dozen worlds. She asked me if 3 words were really enough to answer what had been taken from us. I told her they were not meant to be an answer. They were meant to be a promise. The answer would come later, and it would come in a language the council understood far better than words, spoken slowly, carefully, over a length of time they had never imagined a species like ours could sustain. The council's response arrived 4 days later, and I still remember the tone of it, almost amused, almost fond, the way an adult might respond to a child's empty threat. Voss Kelleran himself issued a public statement, calling our message theater, reminding the wider council that humanity had made similar declarations before and had done nothing but continue quietly trading and expanding within the borders they had been given. He suggested, not unkindly, that we consider the matter closed and focus our energy on more productive pursuits. What the council did not see, what they could not see from their comfortable seats in that glass chamber, was what was happening far below their notice, in shipyards scattered across a dozen human systems the council barely bothered to monitor because they had long since decided humanity posed no serious threat. Those shipyards, which had spent over a decade producing cargo vessels, transport ships, and modest defensive craft, began quietly shifting their production lines. Engineers, who had spent years designing efficient civilian transports, turned their attention towards something else entirely. Materials that had once been earmarked for colony expansion were redirected. Workers who had built lives around ordinary manufacturing jobs found themselves, almost overnight, contributing to something far larger than any of them fully understood at first. None of it happened in public. There were no grand announcements, no parades, no speeches broadcast across the stars. It happened the way most important things in human history have happened, quietly, patiently, one decision at a time, made by people who understood that the greatest strength of a long memory is that it does not need to shout. Grace was assigned to a small planning division working directly beneath the Expeditionary Corps command, And though she could not share every detail with me, even as her father, I could see the change in her over the following months. She grew quieter, more focused, the same quiet I had carried since childhood. She spent long nights studying star charts and fleet movements, learning the architecture of council power structures the same way I had studied them 15 years earlier, except now she had far more information to work with, information gathered patiently over an entire generation. I asked her once, during a rare quiet dinner together, whether she was afraid of what was coming. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering. She said she was not afraid of what was coming. She said she was afraid of what might have happened if no one had remembered at all, if the Kestrel had simply been forgotten, filed away as an old tragedy with no lasting consequence, if the promise I made in that chamber had faded the way the council assumed it would. I told her that was the one thing I had never allowed myself to fear, because I had grown up watching my mother refuse to let it happen, and I had spent every year since making certain it never would. Outside our window that night, the sky was full of ordinary stars, quiet and distant, giving no sign of the storm being built beneath them. Somewhere among those stars, the Tesserae compact continued its slow, comfortable expansion, confident that a single dismissed warning from a young species had already been proven correct. They believed the matter was closed. They had no idea that for us, it had only just properly begun. In the months following our message, I watched Grace change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She stopped attending the small social gatherings she used to enjoy with friends from her academy days. She spent long hours poring over data that arrived through channels I was not always permitted to know about, even as her father, even as someone who technically outranked most of the officials she reported to. I understood why. Some knowledge is safer kept small, contained within a tight circle of people who understand exactly what is at stake if it were to spread too widely. I remember one evening, nearly 6 months after Halden was seized, when Grace came home later than usual, her eyes tired but strangely alert. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we had first read that terrible report, and she told me something that stayed with me for a long time afterward. She said that in her studies of the Tesserae Compact's internal politics, she had found something surprising. Many of the officers and administrators responsible for approving the Halden seizure had already moved on to other assignments, other projects, treating the matter as a minor administrative success rather than the beginning of anything significant. To them, the seizure was already old news, filed away and mostly forgotten within a matter of weeks. She told me this confirmed everything we had suspected about how quickly their institutional memory faded, how little weight a single decision carried once the immediate excitement wore off. For them, Halden was a footnote. For us, it remained an open wound, tended carefully, deliberately kept alive not through anger, but through simple, unwavering attention. I asked her if that difference frightened her. She said it did not frighten her. It clarified something important. It proved, more than any speech or any warning ever could, exactly why our approach would eventually succeed where a louder, angrier response might have failed. A species that forgets easily cannot be worn down by patience, because patience requires memory to sustain it. We had memory in abundance. All we needed was time. I asked her, that same evening, how she managed to carry such a heavy responsibility without letting it wear her down the way I sometimes feared it might. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering, turning her cup slowly between her hands. She told me she thought of it less as a burden and more as a kind of inheritance, something passed down carefully, meant to be carried forward rather than endured. She said that framing made all the difference, that a burden eventually breaks the person carrying it, while an inheritance simply becomes part of who they are. I did not have a response ready for that. I simply nodded, watching my daughter in the dim kitchen light, understanding in that moment how completely she had absorbed every lesson I had ever tried to teach her, and how thoroughly she had made those lessons entirely her own. During that period, engineers across a dozen shipyards worked quietly through countless design revisions, balancing speed against precision, always guided by the same underlying principle that had shaped every decision since my original speech to the council. Nothing about our preparation was meant to overwhelm. Everything was meant to be exact, deliberate, impossible to mistake for reckless aggression once the wider galaxy finally took notice. I traveled to several of those shipyards myself during that year, walking through vast construction bays where quiet, focused workers assembled vessels unlike anything Earth had produced before, built not for conquest but for precision, for the kind of surgical accuracy our entire strategy depended upon. I remember standing beneath the frame of one particular vessel, watching sparks drift down from welding equipment far above, and thinking about how strange it was that something built with such careful restraint could still feel, in that moment, like the quiet turning of an enormous wheel that had finally begun to move after 15 years of standing still. During that same visit, I watched a training exercise held in a wide simulation hall attached to the main shipyard, where young officers practiced coordinated maneuvers against holographic projections of Thesserai vessels built from years of gathered observation data. Grace was among them that day, though she did not know I was watching from the upper gallery. I saw her call out corrections to her unit with a calm, level voice, never raising it even when the simulated formation began to break apart under pressure. She adjusted, regrouped, and guided her team back into position within seconds, the same steady discipline I had come to recognize in her ever since she was a child. Afterward, when the session ended and the holographic projections faded back into empty air, she found me waiting near the gallery entrance. She did not seem surprised to see me there. She simply asked what I thought of the exercise, and I told her honestly that watching her lead reminded me of watching my mother manage an entire household through years of quiet hardship without ever once losing her composure. Grace smiled at that, briefly, before her expression settled back into its usual careful focus. She told me something that day I have never forgotten. She said she did not think of herself as preparing for war. She thought of herself as preparing to keep a promise, the same promise I had made in that chamber long before she was born, and she intended to make sure it was kept properly, without unnecessary harm, without losing sight of exactly why it mattered in the first place. I left that shipyard with a quiet confidence I had not expected to feel so early in the process. Whatever came next, however long it eventually took, I understood that the promise was no longer resting solely on my shoulders. It had been carried forward, deliberately and carefully, into hands I trusted completely. The first strike happens exactly 1 year after the message was sent, to the very hour, and I am standing in the command room on Earth when the report comes through, watching numbers and coordinates scroll across the main screen faster than I can fully process them. This is not the moment for celebration. This is the moment 15 years of quiet preparation finally becomes real, and there is no room left for hesitation. We did not attack the Thesserai Compact as a whole. That decision had been debated for months among our command circles, and in the end, the reasoning was simple. A war against an entire coalition of species would have been exactly the kind of chaos the Council expected from us, loud, reckless, easy to unite against. Instead, we chose precision. We identified the exact fleet elements responsible for the seizure of Halden, the exact commanders who had signed the orders, the exact ships that had carried our people out of their homes. Our first target was a single Thesserai battle group stationed at the edge of Halden space, a group that had grown comfortable and slow after over a decade of uncontested patrol duty. Grace was part of the planning team that mapped their patrol rotations down to the hour, studying months of quiet observation data gathered by ships disguised as ordinary trade vessels, ships that had been drifting through that region long before the seizure ever happened. The strike itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Our ships appeared exactly where the Thesserai patrol expected empty space, moving with a coordination that had been rehearsed 100 times in simulation, but never once in real combat. We disabled their communication arrays first, cutting off any chance of an immediate distress call. Then we systematically neutralized their weapons platforms, one by one, with a precision that left their hull mostly intact. We did not destroy that fleet. We could have. Grace told me later that the order had been clear from the very beginning, repeated in every briefing, until it became second nature. This was never meant to be a war of destruction. This was meant to be a debt collection, precise, controlled, and impossible to mistake for random aggression. Attached to every strike, embedded in the final transmission sent to each defeated commander before we withdrew, was the same simple message. This is about Halden. This is about what was taken and never returned. Return what belongs to us, and this ends. The Council's reaction, when it finally came, was slower than I expected. For the first few weeks, their public statements treated the strike as an isolated incident, a rogue action by an overly emotional species finally showing its true colors. Voss Kelleran himself appeared in a recorded address, calling for calm, assuring the wider council that this would be resolved through proper diplomatic channels, that humanity would soon understand the consequences of provoking a coalition as old and as powerful as the Tesserae Compact. Then came the second strike. Then the third. Each one followed the same pattern, precise, controlled, always tied directly to the specific commanders and fleet elements connected to Halden, never expanding beyond that boundary, never touching civilian targets, never touching worlds that had no connection to what had been taken from us. We were sending a message far more complicated than simple aggression, and it took the Council months to fully understand what that message actually was. We were not trying to win a war in the traditional sense. We were demonstrating that we could sustain a campaign indefinitely, that we had the patience and the resources to keep this going for as long as it took, and that every single strike would remain focused, deliberate, and directly tied to the original debt. There would be no escalation into full-scale conquest. There would also be no surrender, no quiet withdrawal, no fading away into forgotten history the way the Council had originally predicted. The turning point, the moment historians still study today, came nearly 8 months into the campaign, when our forces intercepted a Tesserae command vessel carrying Fleet Commander Halric Doss, one of the senior officers who had personally overseen the seizure of Halden. His ship was disabled during a routine patrol along a route we had studied for weeks, and rather than destroy the vessel outright, our forces boarded it directly. I was not present for that operation, but Grace was, and she described it to me later with a kind of quiet intensity I had rarely heard in her voice. She said the Tesserae commander expected to be killed. He had clearly been prepared for that outcome, calm in the way of someone who had accepted his fate the moment his ship lost power. What he was not prepared for was what happened instead. We did not harm him. We did not interrogate him with any kind of force. We simply held him for 11 days aboard one of our support vessels, treated him according to every protocol of basic decency, and then returned him, along with his crew, back to Council space, completely unharmed. But we sent him back with something else, a detailed data packet, carefully assembled over months, containing precise documentation of Tesserae fleet movements, supply routes, and command structures that we had gathered through years of quiet observation. Enough information to prove, beyond any argument, that we had known exactly where every one of their vessels would be for a very long time, and had chosen, deliberately, not to strike anywhere beyond the narrow boundary tied directly to Halden. The message attached was simple. We could have done far more. We chose exactly how much to do, and exactly where to stop. That choice remains ours to make, for as long as this continues. Grace told me that Commander Doss said very little during his time aboard our ship, but on the final day, just before his shuttle departed, he asked her a single question. He asked her why we had not simply destroyed his fleet when we clearly had the ability to do so. She told him what I had told her many times before, the same lesson passed down from my mother, then from me, now carried forward into her own voice. She told him this was never about destruction. It was about making sure a debt, once acknowledged, was never allowed to disappear into comfortable forgetting. I think that exchange, more than any single strike, more than any battle report, is what finally began to shift the mood within the Council chamber. A defeated fleet is easy to dismiss as bad luck, a temporary setback in an otherwise stable balance of power. A defeated commander returned alive, carrying proof of exactly how much restraint had been shown, is far harder to explain away. Over the following months, the pattern of our campaign became impossible to ignore. Every strike remained precise. Every strike remained tied directly to Halden. Every strike ended with the same offer, quietly repeated, patiently repeated, never changing in its core demand. Return what belongs to us, and this ends. The wider galaxy began to take notice in ways the Tesserae Compact clearly had not anticipated. Other species, smaller powers who had long lived in the shadow of Council authority, began watching our campaign with a kind of quiet fascination. Some sent private communications to Earth, careful and diplomatic, asking questions about how such a young species had managed to sustain a coordinated effort for so long without losing focus, without descending into the kind of chaotic overreach that had doomed similar campaigns by other species throughout Council history. One such message came from a small delegation representing a species called the Orin, a people who had lost an entire moon system to compact expansion nearly 2 centuries earlier, long before humanity had ever left its own solar system. Their representative, an elder named Corwin Tate, who had studied human culture extensively from a distance, asked to meet with me privately during a brief diplomatic stop along one of our supply routes. We spoke for several hours in a quiet observation lounge aboard a modest transport vessel, and I remember him asking me, with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, how we managed to keep an entire species aligned behind a single unwavering purpose across so many years, when even a handful of decades had proven enough to fracture the resolve of his own people after their moon system was taken. I told him the honest answer, the same one I had given the Council so long ago. We did not maintain unity through force or constant reminder. We maintained it by raising each new generation to understand, quietly and naturally, that some responsibilities are simply inherited, absorbed the same way a child absorbs language, without ever needing to be forced. Corwin left that conversation thoughtful and quiet, and though his people never joined our campaign directly, word of that meeting spread carefully through certain circles across Council space, adding to a growing sense among smaller species that the balance of power built around Tesserae dominance might not be as permanent as it had always seemed. I remember reading through some of those messages late at night, sitting in the same kitchen where Grace and I had first read the report about Halden. I thought about how strange it was that the very trait the Council had mocked in that glass chamber all those years ago, our refusal to let time soften a debt, was now the exact trait other species were quietly studying, quietly admiring, quietly beginning to fear. Grace continued rising through the ranks of the planning division during this period, her instincts sharp, her focus unwavering. She reminded me constantly of my mother, though she had never met her, carrying the same quiet strength, the same refusal to let a wound simply fade because enough time had passed. I watched her grow into someone capable of leading far more than a single planning team, and though I never said it directly, I think she understood, long before I did, that she would eventually be the one to carry this responsibility forward, long after I was gone. Nearly 2 years into the campaign, we received our first direct communication from the Tesserae Compact, expressing something other than dismissal. It was brief, carefully worded, and clearly written by someone far less confident than the delegates who had laughed in that chamber years earlier. It requested a private meeting, away from the wider Council, to discuss what they carefully referred to as a misunderstanding regarding the Halden system. Before that message arrived, though, there was a period of nearly 3 months where our operations slowed considerably, not because our resolve had weakened, but because the Compact had finally begun adapting to our tactics in ways that made further strikes more difficult and more dangerous to execute cleanly. They rotated their commanders more frequently, varied their patrol patterns unpredictably, and began investing heavily in improved detection systems, specifically designed to counter the kind of quiet, patient observation our forces had relied upon for years. I remember a tense strategy session during that period where several younger officers argued for escalation, for expanding our operations beyond the strict boundary we had maintained since the very beginning, frustrated by the sudden increase in difficulty. Grace overruled that suggestion firmly, reminding the room that the entire strength of our position rested on discipline, on proving that our patience could not be provoked into recklessness no matter how difficult the path became. She argued that adapting our methods was acceptable. Abandoning our principles was not. We spent those 3 months refining our approach instead of expanding it, developing new methods of gathering intelligence that did not rely on the patterns the Compact had learned to anticipate. It was slower, more painstaking work, but it preserved exactly the reputation we had spent years carefully building, a reputation that mattered, in the end, far more than the speed of any single operation. I remember showing that message to Grace, watching her read it twice before setting it down. She asked me if this meant it was almost over. I told her I did not know for certain, but something in the tone of that message felt different from anything the compact had sent before. In the weeks before that private meeting request arrived, our campaign had grown into something far larger than the original scattered strikes against isolated patrol groups. Grace had been promoted to lead an entire coordination division, responsible for synchronizing operations across several systems at once, always careful to maintain the same discipline that had defined the campaign from its very beginning. I remember sitting in briefings where she outlined new operations with a calm, methodical precision that reminded me, more and more with each passing month, of the same quiet strength my mother had carried throughout her entire life. One operation in particular stayed with me long after it concluded. A Thesserai supply convoy, responsible for transporting resources extracted from Halden itself in the months before the seizure was even formally announced, was intercepted along a quiet trade route far from any major council outpost. Rather than simply disabling the convoy, our forces redirected it entirely, escorting it instead toward a small, quiet human outpost where its cargo was carefully inventoried and documented. Every item taken from Halden during those final months, from raw materials to personal belongings hastily left behind during the evacuation, was cataloged and eventually returned to the families who had lost them. It was a small operation compared to the larger strategic strikes, but it carried enormous weight among our own people, a reminder that this campaign was never only about strength or precision. It was about restoring something specific, something personal, piece by piece, to the exact people it had been taken from. I remember visiting one of the families who received their belongings during that operation, an elderly couple who had spent 9 years building a small orchard on Halden before losing it in a single afternoon. The husband, a quiet man named Peter Langley, held a small wooden box that had belonged to his late wife's mother, turning it over slowly in his hands, as though he could not quite believe it had found its way back to him after everything that happened. He did not say much. He simply thanked me, his voice unsteady, and asked me to make sure the rest of what had been taken eventually found its way home as well. I told him it would. I believed it completely, even then, though I still had no way of knowing exactly how long that promise would take to fulfill. Not every operation during that period went as smoothly as the convoy recovery. Nearly a year into the campaign, I received a call in the middle of the night that stopped my heart cold. Grace's own strike team had been discovered mid-operation near a heavily guarded Thesserai relay station, their approach compromised by a sensor sweep no one had accounted for during planning. For nearly 6 hours, communication with her team went completely silent, and I sat alone in the command room, staring at a blank status screen, unable to do anything but wait. I remember pacing the length of that room more times than I could count, replaying every possible outcome in my mind, thinking about the empty locker aboard the Kestrel, about how quickly a single mistake could undo everything we had worked so carefully to build. Officers around me tried to reassure me, reminding me that silence during a compromised operation was standard protocol, not necessarily a sign of disaster. Their words did little to ease the tightness in my chest. When contact finally returned, static crackling through the speakers before Grace's voice broke through, steady despite the exhaustion clearly running underneath it, I felt something in my body finally unclench. Her team had been forced to abandon their original approach entirely, improvising a new route through a maintenance corridor never covered in their original plans, evading detection by mere minutes on 2 separate occasions. They completed their objective anyway, disabling the relay station's long-range communication array exactly as intended, though the operation took nearly 3 times longer than expected and left every member of her team running on dangerously little sleep. She told me afterward, once she had rested enough to speak clearly, that the moment she realized their approach had been compromised, she thought immediately of everything I had taught her about patience, about refusing to panic, simply because a plan had to change. She said she forced herself to slow down, to think clearly instead of reacting out of fear, and that discipline, more than any weapon or tactical advantage, was what ultimately brought her team home safely. That night taught me something I carried with me for the remainder of the campaign. Precision does not mean the absence of danger. It means facing danger with enough discipline to move through it without losing sight of the larger purpose. Every strike that followed after that carried the weight of that lesson. a quiet reminder that the people carrying out this long promise were not invulnerable, that every operation asked something real of the men and women who volunteered to see it through. I told her I did not know yet, but I knew one thing for certain. For the first time since I had stood in that chamber all those years ago, someone within the Tesserae Compact had finally stopped laughing long enough to listen. My name is Zeth Arundai, and I was seated among the Tesserae delegation on the day the human ambassador first spoke his warning in that glass chamber. I remember laughing along with everyone around me. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a young species could stand before beings who had governed the stars for longer than his entire civilization had existed, and speak with such absolute certainty about a future he could not possibly understand. I am not proud of that memory now. I carry it the way one carries an old wound that never fully closes, aching quietly beneath the surface of every meeting I attend. For years after that speech, life within the Compact continued exactly as it always had. Humanity built its farms and its cities and its quiet trade networks along the edges of council space, and we paid them little attention beyond the occasional report confirming their continued cooperation. When the decision was made to reclaim the Halden system, I was not among those who raised any serious objection. It seemed, at the time, like a simple matter of policy, a technical adjustment well within the boundaries of established law. I did not expect silence in return. I certainly did not expect what came after. The first strike against our patrol fleet was treated, at first, as an unfortunate anomaly, the kind of isolated incident that happens occasionally along contested borders. It was only after the second strike, then the third, each one following the exact same careful pattern, that a quiet unease began spreading through our command structure, a feeling none of us wanted to name directly. I remember the day Fleet Commander Halric Doss returned to compact space, alive, unharmed, carrying with him a data packet that revealed just how completely humanity had studied our movements. I was present in the private briefing where that data was reviewed, and I watched senior officers who had commanded fleets for centuries grow pale as they realized the full extent of what had been gathered. Quietly, patiently, over years we had never once suspected were being watched so closely. It was not the strength of the human forces that frightened us. Our own fleets remained, on paper, far more numerous, far more advanced in raw technological terms. What frightened us was the restraint. Every strike had been precise. Every strike had remained tied directly to Halden, never expanding, never escalating beyond what the original debt demanded. A species capable of that level of discipline, sustained across years without a single deviation, was something none of us had encountered before, not in living memory, not in recorded history stretching back further than most species could comprehend. I began quietly reviewing older intelligence reports on humanity, reports that had been filed away and mostly ignored in the years following that first council session. What I found unsettled me more than any single battle report from the ongoing campaign. There were patterns embedded throughout human colonies and trade networks across council space, patterns that had gone unnoticed simply because no one had ever bothered to look closely enough. Individuals who had worked quietly as laborers, translators, and minor diplomatic staff for years, some for over a decade, revealed connections to logistics networks that had remained completely dormant until the exact moment the campaign against us began. It was not that humanity had planted spies in any traditional sense. It was something far more unsettling. They had simply been patient, embedding ordinary people into ordinary roles, waiting for a moment that might never have come, prepared to activate only if it became necessary. I raised these findings during a private session with several other senior compact officials, including Voss Kelleran himself, the same delegate who had responded to the original human warning with such calm, confident dismissal all those years ago. I watched his expression shift as I laid out the evidence, watched the careful diplomatic mask slip just slightly, revealing something underneath that looked very much like fear. He asked me what I believed humanity actually wanted. Did they intend to conquer the Compact outright? Did they intend to dismantle council authority across the entire galaxy? I told him I did not believe either was true, though I understood why the question needed asking. I reminded him that every strike so far had remained strictly confined to forces and commanders directly tied to Halden, that no civilian world had been touched, that no territory beyond the original dispute had ever been threatened. I told him that if humanity wanted conquest, we would already be seeing evidence of it spreading outward, yet the pattern had not shifted even slightly across years of sustained operations. I told him I did not believe that was their goal at all, and that this was precisely what made the situation so dangerous. A species seeking conquest can be reasoned with, negotiated against, eventually exhausted through sustained resistance. A species seeking only the settlement of a specific debt, patient enough to pursue that single goal indefinitely regardless of cost, is far harder to counter, because there is no larger ambition to exploit, no greed to redirect, no fear of overextension to exploit against them. They were not trying to win a war. They were collecting on a promise, and they had made it clear, through every single carefully controlled strike, that they were prepared to continue collecting for as long as necessary, whether that meant another year, another decade, or as I had begun to suspect from studying their history more closely, another century carried forward through generations not yet born. I thought back to something written in an old human historical record I had reviewed during that period, a fragment describing a conflict from Earth's own past that had taken decades to resolve, pursued patiently across multiple human lifetimes until a resolution was finally reached. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that this was not an exception in human history. It was closer to a pattern, a fundamental part of how the species approached conflict when it believed itself to be in the right. The old phrase from that council session returned to me then with new weight. Humans will hunt you forever. I had heard it as a boast 15 years earlier. I understood now that it had been a simple statement of fact, delivered as calmly as a warning about weather, and we had been too comfortable in our own long history to properly measure the danger contained within it. I proposed, during that private session, that the compact reconsider its approach entirely. I argued that continuing to treat this as a temporary conflict to be outlasted was a fundamental miscalculation, one that would only compound the eventual cost of resolution. I argued that the longer this continued, the more it risked drawing in other species who were already watching closely, some with quiet admiration for human persistence, others simply waiting to see whether compact authority itself might begin to weaken under sustained pressure. Voss Kelleran listened carefully, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not respond with the same easy confidence that had defined every previous conversation about humanity. He asked for time to consider the matter fully, and I watched him leave that session looking older than I had ever seen him look before, carrying the weight of a mistake he was only now beginning to fully understand. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reviewing the recorded transcript of that original council session again and again, watching the human ambassador's calm expression as he delivered his warning, listening to the laughter that had followed, my own laughter included, echoing back at me now with a very different meaning. He had not been angry that day. I understood that now, watching the recording with fresh eyes. He had been certain, the way someone is certain about a fact they have known their entire life, passed down to them by people who had lived through the consequences of forgetting. We had mistaken his calm for weakness. We had mistaken his patience for a lack of resolve. We had measured his warning against our own history, where grudges faded within a few generations, where leadership changes reset old conflicts into forgotten footnotes, and we had assumed, without ever properly testing the assumption, that his species would eventually follow the same pattern. I brought my findings before an emergency session of the full council not long after, standing in the very chamber where the original warning had been delivered all those years earlier. I remember looking around at the same delegates who had laughed that day, many of them still present, still holding positions of influence, and I watched their expressions as I laid out exactly what continued conflict with humanity would likely cost, not just in resources, but in years, potentially decades, carried forward by a species that showed no sign of losing focus. There was no laughter in that chamber this time. Several older delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats as I spoke, some avoiding my gaze entirely, others watching me with an intensity I had rarely seen directed at a junior official during any previous session. I understood their discomfort. Many of them had sat in this very chamber decades earlier, laughing along with everyone else, and now found themselves facing the consequences of a warning they had dismissed without a second thought. I ended my address with a simple recommendation, one I knew would be difficult for many of the older delegates to accept. I recommended that the compact begin serious negotiations toward full restitution regarding Halden, not because we had been defeated in any traditional military sense, but because continuing to test the limits of human patience was, by every measure I could calculate, a far greater risk than any of us had originally understood. As I stepped back from the podium, I found myself thinking once more about that old phrase, the one that had seemed so absurd 15 years earlier, and so undeniably true now. Humans will hunt you forever. I did not know, standing there in that silent chamber, whether the coming negotiations would truly bring this matter to a close. I only knew that for the first time since this entire conflict began, the compact was finally prepared to listen properly to a warning it should have taken seriously from the very beginning. In the days following that address, I found myself the subject of quiet, careful conversations throughout the compact's inner circles. Some grateful for my honesty, others clearly resentful of a truth they had not wanted to hear spoken so plainly. I did not concern myself much with their resentment. I had spent enough years within council politics to understand that uncomfortable truths rarely make friends, but they occasionally prevent disasters, and I considered that trade worthwhile. I was asked, along with a small group of senior officials, to help draft the initial framework for negotiations with Earth's representatives. It was strange work, translating decades of accumulated grievance into precise, careful language that both sides could agree upon without either feeling as though they had surrendered something essential. I spent long hours reviewing human historical records during that period, trying to understand more deeply the pattern I had only glimpsed before, and I found myself growing quietly fascinated by the sheer consistency of it, the way certain principles seemed to repeat themselves across centuries of human history, regardless of which nation or culture was involved. I remember one particular record I reviewed, describing an old human tradition of formally acknowledging debts between families, sometimes resolved not by the original people involved, but by their children or grandchildren, carrying forward an obligation that had outlived the person who first incurred it. It struck me as remarkable, not because it was unique among galactic species, but because humanity had built so much of its modern behavior directly upon such an old, deeply personal tradition, scaled upward until it became something capable of shaping the policy of an entire species. When the formal negotiation sessions finally began, I made a point of requesting a seat at the table, despite holding no direct authority over the final terms. I wanted to witness, firsthand, the moment this long conflict finally began moving toward resolution. I remember the calm, steady presence of the human delegation, led by a woman named Grace Marsh, whose reputation by that point had already spread quietly throughout council space as someone whose word, once given, could be trusted absolutely. She reminded me, in certain unmistakable ways, of the very first human ambassador who had stood in our chamber decades earlier, carrying the same quiet certainty, the same refusal to be rushed or intimidated by the weight of history surrounding her. During a brief recess in those early sessions, I found myself walking alone through a small memorial garden the humans had established near their embassy grounds, a quiet space filled with simple stone markers bearing names I did not recognize. A young human aide noticed me standing there and explained, gently, that this garden honored the crew and passengers of a colony ship lost generations earlier, the very ship whose story had first been spoken aloud in our council chamber so long ago. I stood there for a long while, reading names carved into cold stone, feeling something shift quietly inside me that I had not expected to feel. I had spent months studying human patience as a strategic trait, a pattern to be measured and countered. Standing in that garden, surrounded by the quiet weight of so much loss, I understood for the first time that it was never only strategy, it was grief, carried carefully across generations, refusing to be diminished simply because time had passed. I returned to the negotiation table that afternoon with a different understanding of what we were truly discussing. This was not merely a dispute over territory or resources. It was the closing of a wound that had never been allowed to heal improperly, tended instead with the same careful attention a gardener gives to something worth preserving. I carried that understanding with me through every remaining session, and I believe it shaped the tone of our final agreement, far more than any purely political calculation ever could have. I think often, even now, about that quiet garden, and about how easily an entire species can mistake sorrow carried with discipline for something colder, something merely tactical. It was neither. It was simply love, expressed in the only language time allows those who refuse to forget. The doors of the council chamber close behind me, with the same quiet sound I remember from decades earlier, and for a moment I simply stand still, letting the familiarity of the room settle over me. My hair has gone fully gray now, my hands are not as steady as they once were, but my voice, when I finally speak, carries the same calm certainty it did the very first time I stood in this exact spot. 43 years have passed since I delivered that original warning. 28 years have passed since the campaign over Halden finally reached its resolution. A resolution built not on conquest, but on patience carried far longer than anyone in this chamber had once believed possible. I am here today, older, slower, but still standing, to formally close the matter that began with a single dismissed message so many years ago. The negotiations that followed Zeth Arundai's emergency address took nearly 2 years to complete, longer than either side initially expected, but shorter, I think, than either side had feared. The Tesserae Compact agreed to full restitution of the Halden system, along with formal reparations covering the years our colonists had spent displaced from their home. More significant than either of those terms, though, was the third condition, the one that mattered most to me personally, the one that would echo far beyond this single conflict. The Council agreed to formally recognize, within its permanent legal framework, the validity of multi-generational sovereign claims, acknowledging for the first time in its long history that a species could pursue the settlement of a debt across as many years as necessary, without that pursuit being dismissed as irrational or excessive, simply because it outlasted the political cycles of other species. It was not a victory built on destruction. Grace made certain of that throughout every stage of the campaign, carrying forward the same principle I had tried to establish in that very first speech. We did not want to conquer the galaxy. We wanted the galaxy to finally understand that a promise, once made, could not simply be waited out. Grace stands beside me now in this chamber, no longer the young planning officer who once read reports over my shoulder in a dark kitchen, but the commanding officer of the entire Human Expeditionary Corps, respected across council space in a way I could never have imagined during those early years. She has her own daughter now, a bright, serious child named Ellie, who already asks careful questions about the old photograph of the kestrel that still sits, all these years later, on a shelf in our family home. I think often about the cost of everything that happened between that first warning and this final resolution. I think about the friends who did not live to see this day, officers and engineers and quiet planners who spent years of their lives working toward a goal many of them privately doubted would ever fully succeed. I think about the families who waited patiently through years of uncertainty, raising children who grew up understanding, without ever being told directly, that some promises are inherited rather than chosen. I think most of all about my mother, who never lived to see any of this, who spent her final years quietly teaching a frightened boy that memory, carried with purpose, could eventually become strength. Before the formal closing session began, I was given a private moment with several members of the current Tesserae leadership, none of whom had held any position of authority during the original seizure of Halden decades earlier. They were young by the standards of their own long-lived species, and I could see in their expressions a mixture of respect and quiet unease, the look of people who had inherited a debt they had no direct hand in creating, yet fully understood they were obligated to help settle. One of them, a careful, thoughtful delegate who introduced himself simply as Wren, asked me privately whether I harbored any lingering resentment toward his people, given everything my family and my species had endured over so many decades. I considered the question seriously before answering, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. I told him that resentment, left unchecked, curdles into something that consumes the person carrying it far more than it ever harms the one it is aimed at. What we had carried instead was not resentment, it was resolve, a very different thing, cooler and steadier, capable of enduring exactly as long as necessary without ever needing to become bitter. I told him that the moment the debt was properly settled, Resolve had no further purpose, and it would be set down completely, the way a traveler finally sets down a heavy pack after a long journey. He seemed to consider that answer carefully, and before he left to prepare for the formal session, he told me something I did not expect to hear from a member of the compact. He said that his own grandmother had once sat in that same chamber and laughed along with everyone else on the day of the original warning, and that she had spoken of it many times over the years, not with pride, but with quiet regret, as a lesson she hoped her descendants would never need to relearn the hard way. As I finish my closing address to the council, formally marking the resolution of the Halden matter, I notice a young delegate near the edge of the chamber, watching me with an expression I recognize immediately, the same careful curiosity I once carried myself as a young man standing in rooms far older than my own understanding. After the session ends, as the chamber slowly empties, she approaches me quietly, introducing herself as a junior representative from a smaller species recently admitted into full council membership. She asks me a question I suspect she has been holding on to for the entire session, waiting for the right moment to finally voice it. She asks me why humanity did not simply take advantage of its position during the campaign to expand its influence far beyond Halden, why we did not use the clear demonstration of our capability to pursue greater conquest across council space when the opportunity was so plainly available. I consider her question carefully before answering, thinking back across 4 decades of quiet decisions, careful restraint, and patient resolve. I tell her that humanity never wanted to rule this galaxy. We wanted, more than anything else, for our warning to be believed the very first time it was spoken, so that no other species would ever have to endure what we endured aboard a quiet colony ship called the Kestrel, so that no other family would ever have to teach a frightened child how to carry grief into purpose. She thanks me quietly for the answer and walks away, and I am left standing alone for a moment in the wide, curving hallway outside the chamber, the same hallway I walked through 43 years ago after being laughed at for daring to speak the truth about who we are. Grace joins me a moment later, glancing at a small screen in her hand, and tells me that a news feed is already circulating throughout council space, reporting on the formal resolution of the Halden matter and the new legal precedent now permanently recorded within council law. She reads part of the report aloud to me as we walk slowly toward the transport bay together, and I feel something settle quietly in my chest as I listen to the words. The report notes that the phrase "once dismissed" as an empty threat during an early council session decades earlier has now been formally recognized within council legal doctrine as an accurate description of demonstrated human behavior, cited as reference in ongoing discussions about long-term diplomatic strategy involving newly contacted species. Humans will hunt you forever, no longer laughter, no longer dismissal, simply fact, recorded permanently within the same chamber where it had once been mocked, carried forward now as a lesson for every species yet to come. As Grace and I step aboard our transport, I look back one final time at the great glass chamber shrinking slowly behind us, its lights still glittering exactly as they had all those years ago, though everything beneath those lights had finally, permanently changed. I think about young Ellie waiting for us back home, about the story she will grow up hearing the same way I once heard it from my mother, carried forward not as a burden, but as a quiet kind of strength. Some debts take a lifetime to settle, some take several. What matters, in the end, is not how long it takes, but whether the promise made at the very beginning is ever allowed to fade. Ours never did. Before we boarded the transport home, an older Thesserai official I did not recognize approached me quietly near the chamber entrance, waiting patiently until the small crowd around me had thinned. She introduced herself simply as a records keeper, responsible for maintaining the council's permanent archives, and told me she had spent the better part of the morning updating the official transcript of my very first address, the one delivered so many decades earlier. She said future generations reading that transcript would now find, alongside my original words, a formal annotation confirming their accuracy, an acknowledgement rarely if ever granted to any statement made before this council. I thanked her, and she nodded once before disappearing back into the emptying chamber, leaving me with a quiet sense that something important had just been properly closed. Grace settles into the seat across from me as the transport clears the station's outer ring, and for a long while neither of us speaks. I watch the stars stretch past the window, the same slow, patient movement I remember from that very first flight home, decades ago, when I was still young enough to believe the hardest part of this story had already been told. She finally breaks the silence, asking me if I ever imagined, back when I was young, that it would take this long. I tell her the truth. I never allowed myself to imagine a timeline at all. My mother taught me that measuring a promise by how long it takes to keep is the surest way to abandon it too early. We simply did what needed doing, one careful year at a time, and let the years add themselves up on their own. She tells me that Ellie has been asking more questions lately, old enough now to understand fragments of the story, beyond the simple version we once told her as a small child. She wants to know what happened to the people who were taken during the original attack on the Kestrel, the ones who never came home. I feel the old weight settle over me again, familiar after all these years, no longer sharp, but never fully gone either. I tell Grace what I plan to tell Ellie myself, when she is a little older, when she is ready to carry the full weight of it. I will tell her that some answers take generations to find, and some questions never receive a clean answer at all. What matters is that we never stopped asking, never stopped remembering, never allowed the silence following that night to become the final word on what happened. We sit quietly for a while longer, watching the stars, until Grace finally speaks again, her voice softer this time. She asks me if I regret any of it, the years of preparation, the strikes, the long negotiations, the entire shape our lives were forced to take because of a warning delivered in a chamber full of laughter so many decades ago. I consider the question carefully before answering. I tell her I regret the cost, always, every single loss along the way, every family that waited anxiously through years of uncertainty, every young officer who did not live to see this final resolution. But I do not regret the promise itself. I do not regret refusing to let it fade. If given the same choice again, standing once more in that chamber as a young man with nothing but a single message to deliver, I would choose exactly the same path, because the alternative, quiet forgetting, comfortable silence, was never truly a choice at all, not for people who understood what had been taken from us. Grace grows quiet for a moment, watching the stars drift past the window, before she tells me something she has apparently been considering for some time. She says that her own command staff has already begun discussing how best to preserve everything learned throughout the campaign, not as a weapon to be used again, but as a record, carefully documented, meant to remind future generations exactly what patience joined with restraint can accomplish without ever tipping into cruelty. She tells me that a small research division has proposed establishing a permanent archive, open eventually to scholars from any interested species, detailing not just the military strategy behind the campaign, but the personal stories woven through it, families like the Langleys, officers like the ones lost during those dangerous early operations, the quiet negotiators who spent years translating grief into precise, workable language at the bargaining table. She believes, and I find myself agreeing completely, that the true lesson of everything we endured was never about strength alone. It was about the discipline required to remain patient, without ever losing sight of decency. I tell her I think her mother, meaning my own late wife, who passed peacefully years before the campaign ever began, would have been proud beyond words to see the woman Grace had become, capable of leading with such a careful balance of resolve and compassion. Grace smiles faintly at the mention, her eyes glistening briefly before she looks back out toward the stars, and for a while neither of us speaks again, content simply to sit together in the quiet company of everything we had finally managed to accomplish. The transport carries us steadily onward, and I find my thoughts drifting back one final time to the storage locker aboard the Kestrel, to the frightened boy who once hid there in absolute silence, certain the world outside had ended completely. I think about how far that boy traveled to become the old man, now sitting quietly beside his daughter, carrying a promise finally, fully kept. I think, too, about all the ordinary people who made that journey possible alongside me. People whose names will never appear in any official record of the campaign, engineers who spent quiet years perfecting designs no one outside their shipyards ever saw, translators who spent countless hours studying alien customs simply to make certain no misunderstanding could ever needlessly prolong the conflict, families who packed away photographs and heirlooms and waited patiently for news that sometimes took months to arrive. History tends to remember the names spoken loudly in grand chambers. It rarely remembers the quiet multitude whose steady, unglamorous effort made those grand moments possible in the first place. I have tried, throughout my life, never to forget them, even when the wider galaxy inevitably will. When we finally reach Earth, the sky above our home is a deep, familiar blue, clouds drifting slowly across a quiet afternoon. Ellie is waiting for us near the landing platform, waving eagerly the moment she spots our ship descending, her small figure growing clearer with each passing second. I step off the transport slowly, my legs stiff from the long journey, and I watch her run toward Grace first, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist before turning to look up at me with wide, curious eyes. She asks me if the council finally understood. I kneel down slowly, meeting her at eye level, and I tell her yes. I tell her it took a very long time, far longer than anyone expected, but they finally understood, completely and permanently, exactly what it means when a promise is made and never allowed to fade. She smiles, satisfied with the answer, and reaches for my hand as we walk together toward home, the same quiet stars beginning to appear above us as evening settles gently over the horizon. Behind us, far beyond the reach of any transport, the great glass chamber continues to glitter in the endless dark, carrying within its walls a single sentence now recorded permanently into the history of an entire galaxy, no longer spoken with laughter, no longer dismissed as an empty boast from a young and unproven species. Humans will hunt you forever. It was never a threat, it was simply the truth, spoken once, quietly, and finally, after everything, believed.